Hello, everyone. Welcome. I think we're going to get started pretty much right away. Folks are still coming in. So get yourself ready, grab a beverage, get comfy in your chair, and welcome to our session 2 of WCASA's Sexual Violence Prevention Work Webinar Series. My name is Angie Railing. I am a prevention coordinator with WCASA, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. We will do, you'll get to know a couple of other folks who are doing work on this webinar series in just a moment, but I wanted to make sure that I introduce myself this time. So just some Zoom keeping notes. Everyone is muted for the time being. We are asking folks to use the Q&A function or the chat function to ask questions, and then we will make sure that our panelists do get those questions. So just a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, use the Q&A function, which is located in the panel on the bottom of your screen, or use the chat function, which is on your side. If you would like to use the chat function for kind of a conversation, please be sure that you select all panelists and attendees down at the bottom. So your comment or your question is seen by everyone and not just our us, the panelists and WCASA staff. This session is recorded, just an FYI. So a giveaway, we have purchased some extra books. So if you've registered for these sessions, so each session we will give away a copy of the book that will be discussed here today. There isn't any further thing that you have to do. We will go by registration. So if you are selected as the recipient of this amazing book, Peter will be in contact with you once the webinar is over to get your mailing address. Here is contact information, which you can find on our WCASA website. But here is the information for folks who are working on the webinar series and who are involved in the prevention work at WCASA. Our information is on the screen. We are working remotely, so emails are still the best way to get a hold of us if you need to. We like to always plug some WCASA resources. We do have a pretty robust prevention page on WCASA's website, and we do have a YouTube page. WCASA has a YouTube page, which we have put all of our past webinars, and that is where this webinar will be posted within the next coming few days. We are almost halfway through our series. We are October 23rd with Sexual Citizens. So here is the calendar for the next 4 webinar series, and each one is spaced out every 2 weeks. Our next one is coming super quick. Can't believe it's already November. Registration did go out just a few days ago. It will be going out again if you haven't caught it, or if you didn't see it and you want to make sure to get registered for the next 2 series. For November 6th and November 20th, please connect with Sarah or Peter. And then for the last 2 series, that one will be coming out in roughly about 3 to 4 weeks. So before we begin today's session, it's important to note that the discussion that we will be having today will contain descriptions of actual sexual assaults as students have experienced them. We know doing this work that this material can be hard to listen to, but we also know that in every room that we are in, whether it's virtual or in person, that there will be survivors. So we encourage everyone to take care of yourself, however that looks like to you. And if you need support, if you are not already connected to a program in your area, we will link on WCASA's website the place where you can go and click your county, and a service provider will be listed there. And if we have anyone outside of the state, you can reach out to the RAIN hotline, which will also be put in the chat for you. And you can call them, and then you can get connected to a provider in your area. So we are going to get started. Just a very short, brief introduction. Today, we are super excited to have Jennifer S. Hirsch and Shamus Khan, the authors of the book Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus with us today. And today, we are super excited to have Dr. Kate Walsh, who will be facilitating the discussion between Shamus and Jennifer. And Dr. Kate Walsh will be introducing herself and describe some of the super cool research she's doing locally here in Madison. Jennifer S. Hirsch is a professor of Socio-Medical Sciences at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. Shamus Khan is a professor and chair of sociology at Columbia University. And Dr. Kate Walsh is a licensed clinical psychologist and tenured associate professor in psychology and gender and women's studies at the University of Madison. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can get started.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for having us. It's really incredible to be here. And I'll just briefly say that I'm a new associate professor here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm starting a sexual violence research cluster that's intended to do research across disciplines on campus on the issue of sexual violence. So I've worked with Jennifer and Shamus quite a bit on the SHIFT study itself. And so I'm super excited to be the person who gets to interview them today about their experiences. So without any further ado, Jennifer and Shamus, could you tell us a little bit about the SHIFT study and why you decided to write Sexual Citizens?
Sure. So first of all, Kate, it's so great to be in conversation with you. Shamus and I are huge fans of you and your work. And so really feels like a family moment. So I'll open with a story and then I'll give a little bit of a context about the broader SHIFT project. So Austin, whose story we tell in Sexual Citizens, was in many ways a very appealing interviewee. He, the one kind of steamy sex scene in the book is Austin and his girlfriend on a hot summer night. It's the 4th of July. They decide to make their own fireworks. I'll leave the rest to your imagination. But he actually had nicknames for the kinds of orgasms that his girlfriend would have. So he had grown into being a man who was a good boyfriend and a committed lover. And it was hard to put that together for him with the story he told us in the interview, what he initially described as a weird experience. Early in his freshman year, he was shuffled off to someone's room, not his own room, because his roommate wanted to be alone with his roommate's girlfriend. And so Austin was directed to go sleep in some other bedroom. When he got there was a girl in that bedroom and she was kind of drunk and she mumbled to him that she didn't want to do anything. And like, that is weird that you would have to say to a stranger who comes into your bedroom that you would need to assert that boundary. And he didn't respect it. He actually got in bed with her and started to touch her body. And then he stopped himself. And in his mind, that had just been categorized as a sort of weird experience. But then later in the interview, we asked him, what is a sexual assault? And he said, well, it's any kind of non-consensual sexual thing. And then his eyes welled up and he was like, fuck me. Like he couldn't put together what he had done with the person that he had become. And so in Sexual Citizens, we wrote Sexual Citizens to ask, and I think in part answer the question, what more could we be doing to prevent assaults like that and other kinds of assaults from happening? In 2014-15, when the project began, so much of the national conversation, as you all know, was focused around adjudication. And it is certainly super important to have adjudication processes, both on campus and off, that don't cause more harm to survivors and that can advance justice. So we're not opposed to that. And the other part of the conversation about campuses was this notion circulating of campuses as hunting grounds. You know, there was even that movie, The Hunting Ground, and the idea that like assaults are committed by people who are terrible people. And we don't deny that there are actually people who intentionally seek to harm their peers. But in Sexual Citizens, we broaden out the question and refocus it in a different way on prevention and on a much broader notion of prevention. And so this was a project I sort of had the idea. I reached out to my friend and colleague, Claudine Mellons, who's a clinical psychologist at Columbia. We put together a rock star team that included both Shamus and Kate. It was 8 faculty members and overall a team of 30 people. And so the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, which was very generously funded by Columbia University, included 3 components. There was an ethnographic research component, which is the kind of work that we'll talk about today. We can explain what that is. There was 2 kinds of survey research. And then there was a community participatory research, a sort of community engagement component where the community was actually the administration. If any of you have ever worked with complex institutions, you know that if you hand them a binder of recommendations, that binder will go with every other binder of recommendations they've ever gotten in the shelf of things to be ignored. And so we didn't want to just say, this is what you should do. And so from the beginning, we were in conversation with administrators about what we were learning and what that meant about the changes that they might envision. And so that's a little sense of the work we did on the SHIFT project. And that was a very long answer.
That's excellent. Shamus, anything to add? Or
No, I think yeah.
Excellent. So the book is broadly organized around 3 big ideas. So the ideas of sexual citizenship, sexual projects, and sexual geographies. And these tend to be the lens through which the book makes sense of sexual assault on Columbia's campus. Can you share a little bit about how these ideas interact with each other?
Sure, absolutely. So sexual projects is an answer to the question, what is sex for? And it may seem like only the kind of question an academic could ask, like, what is sex for? But as it turns out, it's a really important question to ask when making sense of people's sexual lives, but also why sexual assault happens. And, it may seem obvious, like, oh, sex is for having kids or pleasure, except most college students that we talk to, in fact, all of them, were not trying to have children. And a lot of the sex that they were having was not very pleasurable, particularly for the women. And so, instead, we think about how sex is a kind of social act that people engage in order to accomplish something or experience something. And so for some students, sex was for acquiring experience. They wanted to get good at it. For others, it was about increasing their status or the status of the people of the groups that they were a part of. Sometimes sex was for giving comfort to a partner. And sometimes sex is a process of identity formation. For a lot of the LGBTQ plus people, sex was about coming to understand their sexual and gendered identities in ways that they hadn't before, in part because they emerged out of communities that frequently denied those identities. And so, our perspective is that in order to understand why people commit sexual assaults or experience sexual assaults, we need to understand what they're trying to accomplish with their sexual lives. In this sense, while a lot of activism is organized around, an idea that rape is not sex, and Jennifer and I we're not opposed to that at all, we also noted in the research that many of the people who experienced sexual assault and who committed sexual assault described their experiences as having sex. And that many experiences of sexual assault emerge out of initially consensual sexual contact. So another way of thinking about that is that a lot of sexual assaults, not all of them, but a lot of sexual assaults are consensual until they're not. And so making sense of what people want out of their sexual lives is really important, and that's what a sexual project is. Sexual citizenship is the idea that we all have the right to say yes to sex and to no to sex, and we have an obligation to recognize the equivalent rights in others. And where a lot of the political conversation about sex is moralistic about sexual projects, Jennifer and I are not at all moralistic about sexual projects. If people want to just hook up with a stranger, live their best life. But one place where our morality really does come in is with sexual citizenship, with recognizing how we as communities have a community level obligation to cultivate the citizenship of young people. And as people in the world, we have a moral obligation to recognize the equivalent humanity and rights of other people. So I just want to tell one quick story to highlight these two concepts. Gwen was a woman that we spoke to who kind of slipped into the New York club scene with an incredible degree of ease. She was tall, beautiful, blonde, white woman from a fairly advantaged background. And, she may not have been 21, but she was the kind of person that club promoters wanted around. And so she went to these clubs and she told us a series of stories about, the kind of men that she'd met. And she was pretty proud of these. But they were also, to us listening to them, a little bit sad. It was like, kind of B or C list actors, not very famous athletes that she would meet and go back to their hotel rooms with them. And when she got there, she was pretty clear that she didn't want to have sex with them. And her solution to this was to, quote, give them a blowjob so she could get out of there. And here, if we take our concepts, our trio of concepts, you can kind of read through Gwen's experience. Gwen's sexual project was really one of not pleasure, but kind of like status and thinking about her own position as a desirable person in the world. And we saw this moment of like giving these guys a blowjob to get out of there, not as an assault. So it wasn't a sexual assault, but it was a profound failure of sexual citizenship for both people in that room. And for Gwen, we see it not as Gwen's failure, but the failure of the communities that raised Gwen that sort of failed to cultivate in her a sense that, like, if she didn't want to be in that room and didn't want to have sexual contact, she could just walk out of that room. But more importantly, we see the failure of the sexual citizenship of those men, in part because they did not recognize her equivalent sexual citizenship. They did not ask themselves, what does she want in this situation? And they did not ask her what she wanted in that situation. Instead, they just had their own sexual project of pleasure and getting off, and like no sense of her sexual citizenship. The final concept is sexual geography, and it's about how space really matters. And I won't talk, because I've been blathering on for a while now, I won't talk too much about it other than to just highlight, like, the fact that she was in a space they controlled mattered. It was their hotel room. And Jennifer and I think about space and how space creates, it's not just a backdrop, but it's fundamental for understanding sexuality. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that.
Excellent. That's so helpful. You raise a number of different concepts that I think are really intriguing and, bring up so many additional questions. So pleasure, consent, and kind of this labeling and acknowledgement of experiences in different ways that I hope to come back to as well. I think a lot of what you just discussed really leads very nicely into thinking about how sex education factors into preventing sexual assault. So could you speak a little bit more about what you learned about the importance of sex education through the SHIFT study?
Sure. And I think that this is where, for people that, if there are any other researchers in the audience, I think that this is where the combination of the deep dive ethnographic research that we did, which I can explain more in a minute, and sort of the survey research is really powerful. From the students that we interviewed, what we heard about sex ed, they were like, oh, you mean my sexual diseases class? And mostly they had gotten sex ed that was fear-based and that emphasized the terrible things that could happen to them. And we also learned in the survey, in a paper that was led by my husband, John Santelli, Shamus can drop the link to the paper in the chat because it's open access, that women who had received sex ed that included training on how to say no to sex they didn't want to have, which is not abstinence only sex education. It's just sex education that includes a skills development component, because we know as educators that it's not just about transmitting information, it's also about helping people to develop any kind of skills. So anyway, women who had received that kind of sex education were half as likely to be raped on campus. I just want to underline that is a really big effect size. That is as effective as most flu vaccines, that is the target effectiveness for the COVID vaccine. And so we essentially, there exists a vaccine. It wouldn't prevent all sexual assaults because, as we describe in Sexual Citizens, sexual assault is not one thing, it's many things. But it could move us towards a kind of herd immunity for sexual assault. And obviously, the goal is not only to teach people to resist sex that they don't want to have, but to teach people not to rape other people, right? And so in other work that I've done, I've sort of mapped out conceptually how comprehensive sex ed can be a tool for teaching people not to assault. So I feel like that's and the empirical work on that is yet to be done. And actually, Kate has a lot of expertise in why it's so hard to get people to acknowledge that they have perpetrated. But the bigger message in Sexual Citizens is that, you know, campus sexual assault has been framed as a campus problem, and really it's an everyone problem. And what that means is that, yes, certainly schools, K through 12 schools have a big role that they can play in preparing people for a healthy, pleasurable, not harmful transition to sexual adulthood. And every institution that touches young people on the way to adulthood, including families. And I have a lot to say about how families can be sexual assault prevention stakeholders. So schools, families, religious organizations, you know, mainly the conversation in America has been that religious organizations should be spaces free from sexual harm. So, like, agree, yes, and yet that is a pretty low bar for institutions where the whole purpose is to form people who are good human beings. And so we really want to enlist religious institutions as partners in sexual assault prevention. We've been delighted that the book is being taught now at 3 different Jesuit institutions. And so before you say that's never going to happen, we got a rave review in Christianity Today, and we do see there's not a big pro-sexual assault coalition except maybe, you know, in the White House, but like mostly there is not a big pro-sexual assault coalition. And so we feel like this is a way to open up the conversation about sex education in institutions where maybe sex education had felt too scary. So sex education, so prevention, as you all know, right? This is a little bit like preaching to the converted here. Sexual assault prevention is an everyone project before college, and then on campus, as we can talk about, there are lots of other ways, in addition to what campuses are doing, that we think about prevention. If you think about the emphasis on consent that young people currently get, we talk a lot about in Sexual Citizens about sort of driving as a metaphor for a pretty dangerous thing that young people do, for which there is a lot of social investment in helping them do it more safely. And so think about the consent education as if young people were only taught to drive by having us say to them, like, this is a stop sign and this is a traffic light. Okay, now you're good to go, right? And like, definitely stop signs and traffic lights, very important, we support, but that's not driving, right? And in fact, like, you would be a pretty dangerous driver if that's all you could do. And so similarly, we think about the effort that needs to go into helping young people transition into being sexually active, which almost all of them do, in a way that gives them the skills not to hurt other people.
Beautifully said, Jennifer. So at the beginning of our conversation today and in the book, you tell the story of a young man who's realized as he's talking to you that he committed an assault. Along with the need for sex education, this story and others in the book highlight the need for conversations about restorative and transformative justice, also taking into consideration the calls to defund and abolish the police that are gaining kind of recent mainstream attention. Can you speak a little bit more to these ideas and how we as a society should consider shaping sexual citizenship, I should say, with a new set of values?
Yeah, I mean, this is so important. And as much as Jennifer and I, we kind of stay in our lane and we think of our lane as prevention. So, you know, we really focus not so much on what we can do after assaults happen, but instead on how to prevent them. And, you know, still we see the potential for a different kind of conversation to be happening here. And the perspective that we draw upon in Sexual Citizens is a broad intersectional perspective that builds upon classic work from, feminist scholarship in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that really focused on gender and power. And we see that as a super valuable perspective, but we also note that gender is not the only form of power in a society. And there's also race and class and ability and sexuality. And so, thinking about sexual assault as the product of unequal set of power relations makes you realize that there are potentially other kinds of power relations that we should be attentive to. So, for example, every single Black woman that we spoke to told us a story of unwanted sexualized touching. Bears repeating, every single Black woman that we spoke to. That is not just an experience of gender-based violence. That is racialized violence. Racialized violence where those women's bodily autonomy is not respected, in part because of racism. And so, we then, from this perspective, or we could talk about the experience of LGBTQ students and their elevated risks of assault. And, as we began to think through that, we really were sort of inspired by a lot of the conversations that have been happening in parallel, but not deeply connected with the conversations about sexual assault and sexual violence. So thinking about racial justice and policing and punishment, and how we might connect some of the insights from those important social movements to what's happening within the sexual assault world. And one of the things that Jennifer and I take away from that is that we can't punish our way out of this problem. Some of the attention has been to if we just got the adjudication and punishment part of this right, we can get rid of sexual assault. And being inspired by and also deeply concerned about the movements to mass incarceration in the United States and how all the focus on punishment rather than community transformation really have done profound harms to Black and brown communities and poor communities throughout the United States, we think, let's take lessons from that and learn from them and begin to say, well, what could we do in a more preventative way? In a way that, on the one hand, takes a kind of victim-centered approach, which isn't about, a perpetrator-centered approach that is about how do we correctly punish the person that did this, but instead, how do we restore the person who experienced the harm? But also a community-based approach. Jennifer's pointed to the driving analogy before, and, our perspective is that as, public health scholars, the big wins that we have had is not on changing individual behavior, right? So if we just take what are the big wins for public health? Well, one of them is clean water, right? And, how do we have clean water? Well, one approach to clean water would be let's make sure we teach every single person how to clean their water so that every person in the world gets introduced to the fundamental principle of clean water and is instructed on how to clean the water, and it's all their job. It's their responsibility to clean their own water, and if they get sick, well, they didn't clean their water. That is not a very effective way of making sure that there's clean water. Another way to do it is to take a systems level approach and to say actually, you can just open your tap and the water is clean. And so what does it mean to think on that systemic level, where you change systems so that you're not relying on the transformation of individual behavior, but instead on a broader collective community transformation? And so our inspiration is to begin to think a lot more about those kinds of preventative measures and to move further away from, punishment and instead ask about prevention.
Really well said. I'm curious if either of you have thoughts about exactly what these preventative measures might look like in the community.
I mean, I have some thoughts about what they might look like on campus. You know, we did our research on in a particular community, which is, you know, a campus community that spans Broadway. So it was a very specific setting. I think that one of those upstream, you know, when people in public health talk about upstream, they're calling on this metaphor of like a doctor who notices bodies floating by and is like trying to jump in and pull out the bodies, and then thinks, well, maybe I'm going to go upstream, and actually notices that there's a bridge that's broken. And so we take that upstream perspective in conversation with one of the campus leaders, the vice president for housing and dining, about how when the bars close at 4 a.m., there was nowhere for drunk students who wanted to be together to go except back to a bedroom in which there were only 4 pieces of furniture, a desk chair, a dresser, and a bed. And so people are sort of funneled back into these spaces, and we're not judgy. Like, if you want to go back to someone's room with them, live your best life. But sitting on a bed has a sexual meaning and can easily lead to misunderstanding because students don't actually follow the practices of consent in the way that we instruct them. And so Scott Wright, like we could see the light bulb go off over his head as he realized that he was a sexual assault prevention stakeholder. And so because he had all the power, decided to keep one of the dining halls open all night. And he also, you know, the Columbia campus is very tight on space, which may not be the same as the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus. But so typically the lounges in all the dorms were booked from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. with student activity groups. And like, imagine how you felt if you wanted to have a guest in your house and you got back to the house and there were some people there who were like doing something, and they're like, sorry, you can't be in here because we got the room now. And so Scott saw the social harm that was caused by occupying those spaces and not leaving those spaces open for students to just mix in a more spontaneous way with each other. And so they changed the dorm lounge booking policy. Now that might seem like a very granular thing, and it's not applicable to all contexts, but what is applicable to all contexts is thinking about how can we produce spaces in the community where people can be together socially in ways that where they have more control. So I think that that's one overall recommendation beyond the pre-college recommendations that I gave. And I think another very campus-oriented recommendation that Shamus and I have is to think about, and I know that you believe this also, you know, the prevention work has been very siloed, so that there are people who do sexual assault prevention, and there are mental health people, and there's substance use people, and then there are people who do diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I feel like particularly like this sexual abuse, the sexual assault, substance use, and mental health people had pretty much already been in conversation. But Shamus and I argue very strongly in Sexual Citizens that you cannot build campuses with less sexual assault without bringing all 4 of those groups into conversation with each other. And that doesn't mean, like, these are already student services professionals who are overstretched, underpaid, overworked. And so our point is not to give them more work by saying you also have to be an expert in all these things, but rather that campuses need to create opportunities for them to collaborate and to have shared metrics. I'll just give one example of sort of the ways in which these topics are intertwined. We were really shaken by the collective mental health impact of managing sexual assault. Most students don't report, but also most students don't seek out professional help. And so the people on whom they lean are their friends. And that's really a lot for young people who are managing their own lives, don't have clinical training. Some of them are also survivors. There was one really chilling story where a young woman shared her story of being assaulted with a close friend. And that led her close friend to tell her own story of being assaulted, which, according to the first woman, was much worse. And so she had like sought support and actually then felt totally shut down because she felt like I don't have the right to burden this person with somebody who is already burdened. So I think that thinking about the mental health ripple effects through the community of students who are already so tapped out. You know, if a quarter of women are assaulted in college, everybody has a friend who's assaulted, and that means that everybody together is carrying this pain.
That's a really profound message, I think. One of the major themes of the book is really thinking about the role that power plays in risk for sexual assault. Can you speak a little bit more, and you spoke about this a little bit earlier, but can you speak a little bit more about the way that the book really revealed how race, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and other social identities can influence the likelihood of sexual assault, and how youth with marginalized identities may experience power and sexual citizenship a bit differently?
Sure. I mean, maybe I'll just quickly tell the story of Charisma, who was a Black and Latino woman that we spoke to, who described campus as a white space and Columbia and Barnard as a white institution. And, you know, what she meant by that was that, like, the social life of the school really revolved around things that didn't speak to her or resonate with her, and was kind of run by people who, in her evaluation, like, didn't view her as a desirable sexual partner or someone that they really like were attracted to or wanted to be with. And so she, like, you know, she described the campus scene to us as like drunken white guys who couldn't dance and listen to terrible music. And, you know, taking a step back from her story, it's important to recognize we have a chapter in the book called A Toxic Brew. And it's about the combination of whiteness, drinking, and campus spaces that can create toxicity. And it's important for us to recognize that, you know, white students drink significantly more than other students. Black Americans in general drink less than white Americans. Asian Americans in general drink less than white Americans. And so the tie between sexual assault and alcohol consumption is in some ways a racialized vision of what sexual assault is. But Charisma, you know, her solution to this was like to try and find someone in a community that she would be kind of more comfortable with. And she met this guy who lived out in Brooklyn, and like, for those of you who don't know the sort of the terrain of New York, Morningside Heights, where Columbia is, may only be about 10 miles from where this guy lived in Brooklyn, but it took like an hour and a half to get there, right? Like the trains there wasn't a great train system for her to get there. You know, it was the weekend, they were running late. And, you know, the very short version of this is that she ended up in this guy's space. He, you know, made sexual advances. She moved his hand away. He persisted and assaulted her. And, you know, one way to read that experience is to read it through the perspective of him as a perpetrator and sociopath. And that could be true. We have her perspective on this. But I think that there's a lot more at work there in terms of the dynamics of power on campus and the dynamics of inequality on campus that explain her experience. The first is campus as a series of white institutionalized spaces where she's not welcome or where she doesn't feel as welcome drove her off campus to seek other kinds of experiences. That did not cause her sexual assault, but it was a factor at play in explaining it. There's also the fact that she was out deep in Brooklyn, and unlike her peers, many of her peers, she couldn't open up her phone and like use a ride sharing app and spend the $60 it would have cost her to get back to campus. She just couldn't afford it. And so, you know, part of the precarity that she experienced was also a precarity of class, and how for some students, buying your way out of a situation is a possibility. And it's great if you can do that, but if you can't do that and you're at additional risk, then that is something that we need to think about. And so one of the arguments that Jennifer and I make in the book is like, if we're looking at Charisma's story, it is a story of gender. It is also a story of race, and it is a story of class. And it's also a story of her community failure of raising her up in a way where she felt like she could express herself sexually. So part of the story that I skipped is, she moved his hand away and he moved it back. And she said to us, I didn't have a plan B. What had always been my strategy to that point was to like move their hands away, and they just got the message, and I didn't know what to do after that. And so, the failure of the sexual education that she'd had before that was also a factor at play. But this shows the multiple intersecting forms of power that are necessary as part of an analysis to make sense of Charisma's experience. And we could tell similar stories or parallel stories about LGBTQ students and how they're growing up in contexts that deny their sexual citizenship puts them particularly at risk. Our perspective here isn't that there's like no such thing as toxic masculinity, or that like, gender and power doesn't matter. Like, that is not what we're arguing. But if we recognize that LGBTQ people have the highest rates or some of the highest rates of assault, we need to also recognize that we can't explain that through toxic masculinity alone. That part of that is inequality, more foundationally and fundamentally. The ways that inequality are central for explaining why people experience sexual assault, and how for all of us as activists or practitioners or scholars in this area need to recognize that equality is a sexual assault prevention strategy, and struggles for equality that challenge power inequalities in the spaces that we're a part of needs to be fundamental to our prevention work.
I think that's brilliant. And it really dovetails nicely with some quantitative work I've seen recently showing that campuses that have more resources that are focused on creating equality have lower rates of assault. And so I think that, this really parallels that work so nicely. We've spoken about so many different things. And one thing that I think is always interesting to ask folks is about what may have surprised them while they were doing this research. So were there findings and other pieces that came out for either of you that you were not expecting or you found really surprising?
One thing, maybe this wouldn't have surprised you, Kate, but it surprised us, was the extent to which people who recounted assaulting other people thought they were having sex. So, I think about one young man whose story begins, I put on a tie, so I knew I was going to have sex. And then he recounted an evening in which he had been invited to a formal. He wasn't super excited actually about going with that girl. He didn't dislike her, but he wasn't super into her, but it was a high status sorority. And so he accepted the invitation. He was a competitive athlete and it was in season, so he wasn't drinking. She drank a lot. At the end of the evening, he really just wanted to go to sleep. And he recounted this whole story to us as if he were the aggrieved party. So he had no idea that what he had done was assault. But so he really just wanted to go to sleep. It was pouring down rain. He couldn't figure out a polite way to deposit her back in her room without all of them getting soaked. And so he brought her back to his room. And then since she was in his room, and again, you see the sexual geography at play, because she was in his room, in his bed, he then described to us, and this is awful, having sex with her as she went in and out of consciousness. And so you read the transcript and you're like, that's a rape. What is wrong with you? But if you stop with what is wrong with you, then you fail to see that like the failure is not just his, but it's also ours, because he was thinking about sex in a framework of social obligation, and rather than seeing the humanity of another person. His sexual project was maybe not to be embarrassed as a man by failing to come through. Like, I mean, maybe he's a sociopath, right? That possibility is always open to us. But it seems unlikely that he would we didn't have anyone who came in to tell a story of intentionally assaulting anyone. And in fact, most of the interviews were not dyads, but we did happen to interview that woman. And she told us a story of being sexually assaulted, but not that. So, and there were many students. So we interviewed 151 students for the project, and some of them, most interviews took 2 hours. And we started out with, her hearing about their social life and their college projects and their families and their sexual lives, and then asking about assault experiences. There were some students who had been assaulted so many times that they needed to come back for a second or even a third interview. But she was not one of them. And so she really also seemed not to identify that experience as assault. But it was anyway, so Eddie really thought that what he had done was having sex. And that was, I guess surprising, and more than that, profoundly disturbing. Shamus, I don't know, what would be the thing that you found surprising?
I think that I was, I think probably I had like a little bit of a dismissive attitude towards college students and young people today. And I think it was really eye-opening for me about how much they were going through and how little we as community members had done to prepare them. And I think I had a lot more empathy in general for their experiences. The thing that was really notable to me was that the students that we spoke to, everyone had talked to them about the importance of their career. And no one, almost no one, told us a story about somebody sitting them down and saying, sex is going to be a really important part of your life. It's going to be one of the ways in which you connect to some of the people who are the most important to you. You should figure out what you want out of that and develop a plan for how to realize it, And, so basically, like, the messaging that young people get today is so much that we heard about how relationships and intimacy can come later, how none of that stuff is really important. What's really important for them is setting up their career, and like, don't waste time on these other things. And the kids had gotten that message, right? Like, the students that we spoke to said they referred to a relationship as like taking an extra 4-credit class that you didn't get any credit for, right? Like, and it kind of killed both Jennifer and me to hear this, but it was really profound to see how these young people had been deeply influenced by these messages, how they were very attentive to and anxious about their economic futures. But when it came to their intimate futures, they had no real tools to think through it. And if anything, the people in their lives de-emphasized the importance of that. And so I think that to me was eye-opening and it was disturbing. And I thought, like, what if we just had a fraction of the conversations with young people about the importance of intimacy and the importance of figuring out what they wanted with their sexual and intimate lives and developing a plan to realize that. Like, opening up that space, I thought, could do an enormous amount for these young people. And I sort of saw them as like, problems of a world that we have made. And I think, I'll say, like, if you, for the people listening along, like, if you ever if you could imagine a book about sexual assault that's somewhat hopeful, I would say Sexual Citizens is that book. It is not a book steeped in fear. Instead, its emotional valence is kind of empathy and hope. And so I think that what I really learned in writing this book was, this listening to these stories, like, coming to it from a perspective of empathy and hope about them, because I was really inspired by the young people that we spoke to and spent time with.
And actually, Kate, I just want to add one more thing that became part of the book in a way that we hadn't anticipated, which is the extent to which sexual interactions that are not assaultative can be experienced by students as profoundly harmful. So 2 examples, one young woman talking about hooking up said that she really just wanted to hook up with someone who would say hello to her the next day. Right? And like that is a very low bar for sex that is not demeaning. She just wanted somebody to be willing to publicly acknowledge her as not an embarrassing person to have had sex with. There was another interaction where 2 students had an ongoing hookup, and they were both good with it until the man crossed a line. And the line that he crossed was telling the young woman that his grandmother had died and that he was really sad. And she was like, nope, I'm down to fuck, but not down for feelings. Like she ghosted him. That was it. And so there's a lot, as I think, opening up a conversation about the unkindness and lack of recognition of other people's humanity that is, and not in a way that is judgy about hooking up, but it like people should live their best lives, but they should remember that the people that they're having sex with are people. And so that's part of the conversation that Sexual Citizens opens up.
Sorry, I knew I was going to do it at some point. I think this theme of focusing on humanity is something that has come up continually through this. And I think just looking at broader things that are happening in our society and in our culture, we could use a lot more of this in so many areas of our lives. And a few of the comments in the chat have really been about talking about sexual assault in the context of relationships. And I think that you've started to go there with some of what you both mentioned just now. I'm curious if you have any broader remarks or any broader things to say about sexual assault in the context of relationships.
Sorry, I thought for some reason, Jennifer, I thought you were gonna jump in there. I mean, and actually, Kate, I'd love, we've worked on some things together, and so even talking about some of our own collective work would be, I'd love to hear, this, because Kate has just, led with a paper that we've written about how sexual assault is not one thing, it's different kinds of things, it's different kinds of experiences. And so when we think about prevention for sexual assault, like there's going to be no silver bullet, to return to the driving analogy, as Jennifer said, it's really important to teach people to stop at red lights and stop signs, but like teaching people to stop at red lights and stop signs does not make you a safe driver, right? Like you need to know what side of the road to drive on too. And you need to know like what a yield sign means and all kinds of other things. And like, when you need to slow down, you need to look for those like, speed limits and things like that. And like, so the limit of consent education there, but is something that we would point to, but it's not just that, it's that the types of assaults that people experience are very different. So, the drunken assault that is common in many of our imaginations about the college experience is one type of assault that people experience in college. But in the survey that was part of the larger project that we were doing, the survey that was led by Claudia Mellons, I think one of the findings there was we asked people about their experiences of assault in that survey. And then the survey team also asked what was the method of perpetration? And what that question was getting at is how were you assaulted? Was it because of physical force? Was it because of threats? Was it because of verbal coercion? Was it because of incapacitation? So say being drunk. And a little over half of the assaults involved incapacitation. But that means that almost half of the assaults, 43%, I think, did not involve incapacitation. And so all of our programming on alcohol and consent is valuable, except that for more than 40% of the assaults, that's not what people are experiencing. And in those non-drunken assaults, a lot of them are happening in the context where nobody is there beforehand. So it's not a context where you're coming from a party. So the bystander intervention that we're doing isn't going to be particularly effective. And neither party has been consuming substances. And so, in that instance, it looks a lot like intimate partner violence. I mean, it's not necessarily intimate partner violence. There are a range of experiences that it could be. But what this means is that we need to sort of open up the conversation about these different kinds of assaults that people are experiencing. And it's really important because actually the people who experience those kinds of assaults are slightly patterned. It's not just that there are some assaults that are not drunken assaults. It's also that like Black students are more likely to experience the kinds of assaults that are not drunken assaults and that may exist in the context of relationships. And so we need to kind of open up our perspective a little bit and think about what are the multiple different kinds of interventions that we need. So if sexual assault isn't one thing, it's many different things, we're probably going to need lots of different interventions. And, you know, to return to something I said earlier, like if we're not talking to young people about relationships, and a lot of them are experiencing assaults in the context of relationships, like we're kind of falling down on our capacity to prevent sexual assaults and sexual violence. And Kate, I know you've led a lot of work on this, so I'd be interested in your answer.
I think that was a very, very helpful response, Shamus. I have a lot of different thoughts about a lot of different things. I don't know, Jennifer, did you want to add anything before?
What I wanted to add is just to make sure that you are such a gem, and the University of Wisconsin is so lucky to have you. And so just to make sure that you have a little bit of time to tell people about your research portfolio and the exciting new things that you're doing, because I feel like this is a moment where you could develop a lot of interesting collaborations.
Thanks, Jennifer. I really appreciate that. And I will definitely take you up on that at some point here. To come back to this idea that Shamus was talking about before about, you know, sexual violence or sexual assault not being just one thing. I think that that's very true. And I think that the ways that we've been talking about it now for decades is as if it is one thing. And so, you know, ever since we started kind of systematically measuring sexual violence back in the 1980s, we've really been seeing very consistent rates of assault for the last 4 decades at least. And so, you know, this is despite a lot of different kinds of prevention efforts. And I think one of the traps that our field falls into is jumping on the new hot thing and thinking like, this will be the magic bullet. And so right now it's bystander interventions. And I think that, you know, there is a lot of value in these interventions. I think they do great things in terms of building community and building the ways that people think about their communities, and even just helping to inform people about what sexual assault is and the risk factors for it in a way where they can hear the information and aren't getting defensive. So I think there's a lot of value in that. But I think, as Shamus pointed out, with some of these relationship violence types of assaults, you know, bystander interventions may not be as effective, at least not in the ways that we're currently doing them. And I know Jennifer has some thoughts about how to, you know, shift bystander interventions so that they can be broader and really, you know, it's not just intervening when you see something happening in your community, but also intervening around conversations that you're having with people that are in your circle about relationships. And, you know, when you hear people talking about relationships in like a more transactional way, like really reinforcing the humanity piece that Jennifer and Shamus have brought up a few times now. So I think that part just seems, you know, critically important. So I'm happy to speak a little bit about my work, but I also think we've gotten some really great audience questions that I think there could be opportunities for me to kind of weigh in on some of the questions as well. So,
but first, speak about your work.
Okay,
just give people like a little bit of a, you know, just give people a thumbshell of like all the different things that you're doing.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Jennifer. So I am, as I mentioned before, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I did a postdoc actually at Columbia in substance use related epidemiology. And so my area of research really focuses both on monitoring, doing surveillance around sexual violence and figuring out ways that we can do primary prevention. But because I'm a clinical psychologist, I also focus on how to do secondary prevention. So once folks are exposed, how can we prevent them from experiencing mental health sequelae, substance use sequelae, interpersonal difficulties, et cetera. And then once they maybe have developed some symptoms, how can we treat those symptoms most effectively? And so I think that, Jennifer was speaking earlier about our field being really siloed, where, oftentimes it's people just working on the prevention side of things or just working on the response side of things. And I absolutely agree with that. And I think that we need to be thinking about how we can be more connected in those processes. And so one of the big aims of this sexual violence research initiative at the University of Wisconsin-Madison is to bring people together from different disciplines. So right now we have someone who does sex trafficking work in the School of Social Work. We have someone who's in public policy, and I'm very excited about working with her to kind of develop ways to better interact with lawmakers and those involved in the legal system so that we can really work out some of the issues that I think are plaguing our current systems. And then we also, interestingly, have someone who's in the humanities department. So she studies sexual violence in the context of the Old Testament, and then really thinks about how that applies, like, in the context of our current present day situations. And she focuses a lot on like how the media also portrays sexual assault and whether that's rooted in kind of these historical things. And then we have a wide variety of students who are also coming from a lot of different departments. They're often like the only person in their department doing this work. And so they've been thrilled to have like a sense of community and to really have like a group of scholars who is invested in doing this work. We're hoping to do work not just on the University of Wisconsin campus, but also throughout the state of Wisconsin and even more broadly. And so I welcome, any and all contacts and collaboration. So I'd really be delighted if people reached out to me after this to do more work together.
And part of my my goal in making sure that Kate had a chance to introduce herself is, most research has no impact on the world, right? Like we just produce information, it goes out there, it sits on a shelf, it does nothing. And I think that from people, partly it's that we are not always trained as researchers in how to communicate with people outside our field. And I think also people outside feel like, oh, well, the researchers are busy doing their research. They may not want to communicate, but actually there is nothing more exciting than having the opportunity to collaborate with someone who might help your work make a change in the world, right? We know how to produce good information, but we don't always know how to use that information to make an impact. And so that's why, events like this are so rewarding for us, is because it's an opportunity to begin those conversations.
Absolutely. And I'll just add one more plug. Jennifer mentioned earlier how important doing community-based participatory research is. And I wholeheartedly 100% agree with this. And I think SHIFT is such a great example of how to do that. It really illuminated for me just, how to really make that happen. And so I just want to say that to anyone out there who's interested in collaborating, that it really would be a true collaboration and not just me coming in with ideas or whatever. So, okay. So let's get back to a couple of these really great questions. So the first question that I think I have a lot of interest in this as well is thinking about consent. So how students actually navigate it is a really interesting phenomenon. The question here is specifically about whether we should change the way we teach consent or what else needs to be incorporated.
Jennifer, I don't know if
I think we need to acknowledge the limits of teaching consent. It's like starting with calculus when people haven't learned to add. And so if students arrive on campus having had comprehensive, age-appropriate sex education, I think a refresher on consent can be great. And if students, as so many of the students that we encounter, have literally never had a conversation with an adult that has affirmed their sexual citizenship, if the only message they've gotten is not under my roof, then a conversation about consent, like there's no context for students to put that in terms of how sex can or should be. And so I think there's a little bit of this sort of, sexual assault prevention industrial complex where there are these, which is driven by a compliance framework, right? Schools need to do something. So they're like, okay, we're going to do this one thing because we can pay people and then we will be complying with our requirement to do prevention work. And there's a reason we use the word transformation in our acronym, right? The Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, because, think about breast cancer. When my grandmother died of breast cancer, it was a topic that was only talked about in whispers, right? You couldn't even like say the word out loud. And it was also a death sentence. And through sustained public investment combined with intense community activism, there are lots of people now for whom breast cancer is just like a shitty thing that happens. It's not great. It's always scary. But then like most people, if it's found early, do okay. And so that's what we need. Like, I think that's the mindset we need. We need like enough incrementalism. Let's do something, right? And so that means pushing at the federal level to recreate the National Institute for the Prevention and Control of Sexual Assault, which existed under President Carter and then was defunded by President Reagan, right? I think that's like a 100 days agenda part for the Biden administration, because when there was a center of funding for sexual assault research, there's just a lot more opportunities for researchers to produce knowledge that can drive the conversation. And then I think at the state level, again, we're not opposed to that consent education, but I think that particularly public universities and people who have public funding for prevention need to push the school system. I don't know, and I'm sorry for not having done my homework here. I don't know what the landscape of sex ed looks like in Wisconsin, but I do know there are 9 states in America that mandate that sex education must be homophobic, right? If you give any sex education, it must give the message that it's not okay to be gay, right? And so I think, like, what does a student who grew up in one of those states, like, how can they interpret consent education in a useful way? And so I think that really pushing on the policy level, sex education is not a panacea, but it is a fundamental building block of a more robust population level strategy.
Yeah, that's great. And I will, I mean, it's not great. The content of what you're saying is not great, but I think you're right on with the points you're making. I'll also add to, and I know you spoke a little bit to this earlier, but K through 12 sex education often does not include any discussion whatsoever of consent or how to engage in healthy relationships. I think that that's not true for certain pockets. You know, there are certain areas that do a really nice job of it, but in general, it's not required to include those elements. And so I think that another piece for me is that we can't just tell students like the definitions of consent and expect them to be able to like apply those in their own lives. I think students, as Jennifer was mentioning in the chat earlier, they cognitively get it. They can say, oh yeah, of course, or they can say yes means yes, but like when that actually comes to, interacting with someone and implementing what they know in those interactions, it's a very different thing. And so I've given a lot of thought to, we have students who show up on campus who are woefully underprepared to engage in any kind of like sexual encounter with another person. They have no idea how to even, approach having a conversation. And part of that is rooted in like, our society is founded on like Puritan ideals in some ways where we just do not think, talking about sex is okay. So I really think we need to shift the conversation around that. But I also do think that there are really concrete ways we can change how we're doing consent education at the level of universities where we have a little bit more control over what students like have to be exposed to. And I think that these should go more from educational kinds of things to actually like engaging in real conversations and giving people the opportunity to practice and have those like, okay, let's practice having that awkward conversation and kind of go through it. And it'll be less awkward when you actually do it in real life. And let's practice all these different scenarios you're anxious about and really help students like think about what it would feel like to be in that situation before they actually are. So, and we can build in the humanity piece to that too. So I think that there's a lot more that can be done here. Okay. Anything else to add on that, Shamus?
I mean, I just think about how awkward, I had the hard talk with my mom the other day about Thanksgiving, about not wanting to bring our whole family together if there weren't going to be kids in the other family coming from out of state. And so I think we are social beings. We are not health maximizing beings. And so like thinking about acknowledging the real social constraints on people doing what is good for them. Like, I think that's the fundamental contribution of social and behavioral science to public health, is seeing what people are actually motivated by, which is wanting to build connections to other people and to not feel ashamed, right? And so I think thinking about how hard it is to like manage when someone in your pod hasn't been has been breaking the circle, right? And so I think there are lots of ways where we can, from the time that people are young, help them learn to assert their boundaries and respect other people's boundaries. Think about how many times you say to your kids, don't grab, use your words. That is a sexual assault prevention message. So like, as we are forming humans, these are skills that we can be cultivating in our children. And I think we need to remember that, like, no matter how much we do to form our little people, they're going to go out into the world with other people who haven't gotten those same investments. And so there needs to be public structures that foster sexual citizenship for everyone, so that this is not just a thing where the culture of intensive parenting means that rich kids arrive on campus with these skills and less advantaged kids don't.
100% agree with that. I also think that some of the parents who we might rely on to teach these skills may not have gotten any training in this themselves. And so I think that it's difficult for them to be providing this kind of education that we'd like to see when they also don't have those skills either. And so it makes it very challenging.
I mean, that's why I always got to say this, such a big fan of the sleepover. Like, if as a parent, your sexual project for your child is that they experience intimacy and sex and pleasure and commitment all in one package in a relationship, there's no more powerful way to convey that than actually letting them do it. And so what that looks like is when they're, later in high school, if they're in a relationship where their partner wants to join your family for dinner, then you say, like, okay, your partner is welcome to stay for breakfast. And I promise you that will be the most awkward cup of coffee you will ever make the next morning. But like, it is such a powerful way. Like, if you believe in it, then let them do it. And I think that is also a way that parents can, like, you don't have to have a whole conversation about it, right? You just do it. Another thing that Shamus and I obviously are fans of is parents using the book as a tool. I have a number of friends who read Sexual Citizens with their child before they left for college. And it provides an opportunity to talk about the material in the book in a way that is less personal. So you don't have to ask your kid, you don't have to get all in their business because they don't want you there. But you can talk in a more abstract way about, like, what do you think about this story or that story? And we actually, Shamus just dropped into the chat, we have a discussion guide, which you can use for your book club, but you could also use to guide a conversation with your kid. I've had many young people, Shamus and I have both had young people say to us that they felt more prepared for college having read Sexual Citizens.
Well, that's an amazing thing in and of itself. I also just want to give a very quick plug to the Madison School District. When I was here interviewing last fall, the same week I interviewed, there was a story in the newspaper about how the Madison public schools are going to start implementing developmentally appropriate sex education, where they really focus it was just a really exciting thing to see. So I haven't seen a follow-up to that. Obviously, right after that, everything went online. So who knows what form that's taking currently, but I think some school districts are taking on this challenge and others are struggling a little bit more with that. So excellent. Okay. So we have some other really great questions. One that we got is about how you balance non-judgment and objectivity in an interview when someone is blaming themselves for an assault that happened, or normalizing sexual violence. So how do you handle this in those kinds of cases?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just take one moment to say a little bit about our broader methods and then loop into this. So as Jennifer said earlier, there were three major sets of studies that we did. One, a community-based transformation. The second was a quantitative study that involved both a survey and a daily diary, which was surveying people every day for 60 days to see kind of basically some of the things that led to experiences and then the consequences of those experiences. And then the part that Sexual Citizens draws upon that Jennifer and I co-headed, which was the qualitative portion, the ethnographic portion. And there were 3 types of studies that we did. As Jennifer said, we interviewed 151 people. And for some of them, for 25 of them, we did up to 3 rounds of interviews, so spending about 6 hours with them. But what people say and what they do is not always the same. And so we also did participant observation. So the book relies upon hundreds of hours, over 600 hours of participant observation. And what that means is that we hung out with students in the spaces where they sort of go about their day-to-day lives. Now, Jennifer and I did some of this. We did it in public spaces, like, we went to basketball games together and we hung out in the dining hall and, went to dinner with students and things like that. But we also hired a research team that integrated into campus life. And so these were not just younger looking, but actually younger people who went to fraternity events, parties. They were hung out with people in sororities. They were on the buses up to the athletic fields. They hung out in religious student spaces. They hung out with students as they played Catan and made dinner. And this gives us kind of a rich texture of their day-to-day lives. And so there was that. And then we ran 17 focus groups to see about how students collectively talked about it. As part of our research, we had this, we had a mental health and intervention plan. That was not very eloquent, but Claude.
Like a crisis management plan.
Exactly, yeah. Claude and Mellons, who ran the quantitative portion of the project and co-directed Shift with Jennifer, is a clinical psychologist and helped us devise a set of trainings for what we should do if students were in distress. And then, we did a lot of training because Jennifer and I didn't do all the interviews ourselves. Our team did a lot of the interviews with how to interact and hold people's stories in ways that sort of didn't sit in judgment with them, but instead heard their experiences as they recounted them to us. And this is really the aim of an ethnographic study. It's to understand people's experiences from their own point of view and to try and use that then to make sense of things more generally. Now, we had some things where we would intervene if we heard particular kinds of stories. So if we heard that someone was going to do harm to themselves or to somebody else, we had an intervention strategy. And we never actually intervened with any of our subjects. So we never heard of something like this. And some of this might make sense to people if you just think like someone who's intending to harm other people was probably not going to volunteer to sit down with an interview for us. And so there's some selection into the observations that we're able to make. And, Jennifer told the story of Eddie, who was the guy who said, I put on a tie because I was going to have sex, because I knew I was going to have sex. And the person who told us the story about having sex with this woman as she went in and out of consciousness. And sitting through that story was very challenging. If you read that section of the book, there's a chapter in the book where we talk about the accounts of people who committed assaults. So there's a chapter dedicated to making sense of that. We do 2 things in that chapter. I mean, I think we don't let Eddie off the hook, right? We don't just say oh, well, we just have to understand Eddie's point of view. We do say that we have to understand Eddie's point of view in order to change that kind of behavior. And so in order to address the behaviors that we view as problematic, one of the things that we think you have to do is understand why people act in the ways that they do. And this ended up being an incredibly challenging thing to do. And I suspect it's something that many of the people who are listening on this call right now, like, have experienced themselves as practitioners, activists, and scholars in this area, where, like, we did an interview with one woman who told us a series of stories about, her, as she acknowledged, problematic drinking and how it led her into sexual situations that were difficult. And we interviewed her on a Thursday, and we interviewed her again the following Monday, and she had been raped that weekend. She didn't categorize it that way, but she got very drunk and found herself, woke up naked with somebody who had no recollection of how she was there. And this was an incredibly difficult thing to hear about. We provided her at the end of each interview with a set of resources that she could access should she choose to, but we did not, in fact, force an intervention upon her, because our aim as scholars was to open up the space for people to tell stories in the way that they wanted to tell them, and then to use those to make sense of what might be effective prevention efforts. Jennifer, I don't know if you want to add more on the public health approach to doing this kind of research.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would add two things. One in terms of the selection bias, and one in terms of the mental health impact of doing these interviews. So there were various ways in which we recruited students for these interviews. One unintentional method of recruitment was when we sent an email out to the entire undergraduate student body at Columbia announcing the survey. Just heads up, the survey is coming, please don't ignore this. Turns out that most students don't read their emails, so that wasn't the most effective way of announcing the survey, but we got maybe 24 responses back to the anonymous, like, shift@columbia.edu email address saying, I have a story to tell, I want to be interviewed. And so I think, part of what mandated reporting does is it keeps students from sharing their stories of assault with the faculty that they admire and care about and would like to get some emotional support from. And so it was like opening up a fire hose of grief to hear these students' experiences. And obviously, they were not representative of every student's experiences, but they were very moving and powerful. And stories, if you think about an iceberg, what universities access is the tip of the iceberg that's above the water. Those are the stories, those are the assaults that are reported. And so through this ethnographic method of recruiting people and holding their stories with compassion, even when they were very upsetting, we got to swim beneath the waters and sort of map out the whole iceberg in a way that I think that's unique to this kind of research. And then just to piggyback on what Shamus was saying about the, I can't remember the term that we use for it in the research, but the sort of the mental health crisis plan that we had. The instances that we use that were when the interviewers were acutely distressed from doing an interview. And I know that this will be familiar to many of the people in the audience because this is something that you all have probably had to contend with. I mean, I will never forget interviewing a young woman who had a very extreme story of suffering that involved being trafficked and becoming addicted to drugs. And I asked her, well, where were your parents in all of this? And she said, well, they were mostly focused on the fact that I was doing well in school and playing lacrosse. That was really all they cared about. And this was a point where I have my own high achieving child going off to college. And it was so painful to hear that parents' focus could miss that level, could miss that a kid was in that level of trouble. And so I remember, walking up Amsterdam sobbing on the phone with Claude, feeling like, I can't hold the story right now. It is too much. And so there were a number of instances, I think, of that interview that Shamus recounted as one where the interviewer became really acutely distressed and needed to talk with somebody because she felt like she should have been able to prevent what happened over the weekend. And really, there was no way that she could have prevented. If we couldn't guarantee to students that we would hold their stories in complete confidentiality, then they wouldn't have shared their stories with us. But so I just, you all have heard this before, but I just want to underline the importance of taking care of yourselves as you're doing the work, because it can be very hard.
It's incredibly powerful. And I think I can speak for people here and saying thank you for sharing and recounting kind of what that was like from the perspective of the interviewers, and how powerful and painful that was in some instances. I want to shift just a little bit to a question that asks about terminology and phrasing, and how that can play an important role in prevention. And so the question is specifically about how the book mentions reshaping how we use the phrase healthy sex to healthy sex and sexual assault. And if you could speak a little bit more about how the words we use when talking about this concept can be really important for prevention, that would be great.
I mean, I can't remember exactly how this plays out in the book, but my hot take on this is that I remember when we presented Shift to a group of faculty colleagues, and one of them, who does feminist law at the law school, said, healthy sex is not the opposite of sexual assault. Like, health is not the opposite of assault. And so opening up, which I think points to the question of sexual projects, like the opposite of sexual assault is people having only the kind of sex they want to have. And so I think that the word healthy puts a framework on sex. Sex is not a health maximizing behavior, right? Like, hopefully it's not a health harmful behavior, but people don't typically have sex for health reasons. And so I think centering the reasons people want to have sex, helping them be more clear about those reasons, helping them acknowledge that there are some sexual projects, as much as we say we're not judgy about sexual projects, we also append that there are some sexual projects that put you at higher risk of assaulting someone, right? So like, if your goal is to accrue a lot of a sexual experience, live your best life. But remember that the people with whom you are accruing experience, again, are people. And so I think that that is a sexual project where there's a higher risk of assault. On the other hand, in terms of the assault that happens in intimate partner relationships, having sex to provide support and intimacy and build a relationship can also put somebody at risk of assault, because it can force them to consent to sex that they truly and deeply do not want to have. And they might verbally consent, but it's definitely not what they want to be doing. And so I can't remember exactly how we talked about it in the book, but that's how I'm talking about it now.
Yeah, and it almost seems like you're distinguishing between healthy relationships and healthy sex, and those can be very different things, right? So you could be having what one wouldn't consider necessarily healthy sex, if you will, but that can be happening in the context of a healthy relationship, and that is that's a sexual project that is, very helpful answer. So we have another question. Based on your research and expertise, should bystander intervention training change? And are there new things that need to be incorporated into these trainings?
So we're not, we've written one paper on bystander intervention, and in it we note that we look at the ways that men enact bystander intervention. And part of the argument of that paper is that a lot of bystander intervention is actually a gendered behavior, where men see it as their sort of gendered job to intervene, but that a lot of what guides how those men intervene is the relationship with the person who they're intervening with. So if it's a fellow member of their community, say a group of men who are throwing a party and one of their friends is acting inappropriately, their intervention strategy is very different, because they try to preserve that person and their group's reputation, as opposed to if they don't know the person. And so, I would say we're not, having people recognize the relational elements of bystander intervention is really important. we're not experts in bystander intervention. It wasn't the big focus of our research. And I would point to, there's so many scholars who do incredible work on this. Vicky Banyard at Rutgers, for example, who, along with several co-authors, write on this. I think that we wouldn't, and Jennifer and I don't do program evaluation, so we don't evaluate the effectiveness of different kinds of things like bystander intervention. And there are lots of scholars who do very valuable work in that area. I think what I'd say is it is it's almost always a yes and answer. Yes, we need bystander intervention. Yes, we need strategies for it to be more effective. And as you said earlier, Kate, bystander intervention will be insufficient because, many assaults occur where nobody's there beforehand, or where the kind of bystander intervention that would be required is to talk to people about maybe some of the unhealthy dimensions of their relationship, right? So I think here of Adam, who was a gay man who was from a conservative background and really, was thrilled to be in New York, and then, ended up in New York, didn't love being in New York because of all the gay men who said they wanted relationships, but actually just hooked up with him and then ghosted him. And he eventually found a relationship that was super valuable to him. And the only problem, as he said to us, was that his boyfriend was really forceful about sex. And he told us a story about how his boyfriend came home one night drunk and, quote, he basically raped me. Except that Adam didn't talk about that as a rape. And Adam was kind of asleep in his room before that happened. And bystander intervention would not be effective for what Adam was experiencing in his relationship. And so I think instead of just thinking about, I think what Jennifer and I are pushing towards is instead of thinking that we're going to have a super effective policy, what we're saying is we're going to require 20 different policies that each get at this, and that we need to immerse this in people's whole lives. We need to connect the lessons that we give young people all the time about respecting other people's spaces and the importance of their own bodily autonomy and their moral commitments to recognizing the human dignity of other people with their sexual lives. And it's not one lesson or one program, it's going to be dozens of them, really. And, it's going to be a challenge, and the fight for equality is going to have to be a lifelong fight that we are constantly engaged with. But that's how, we're going to find an effective set of prevention measures, which is bystander intervention and.
I think that's an incredibly insightful way of thinking about it. I also think too that there's a lot of variability in the quality and degree to which different places are implementing bystander intervention. So for example, our university health services violence prevention team is phenomenal. And they are just so thoughtful in the way that they're doing their bystander intervention. And really, one of the beautiful things about bystander intervention is that you really can tailor it to the specific community that you're working with. And so when they run trainings with particular groups, they really do a lot of legwork to figure out, what's going to be the most effective, how can I provide examples, and really talk through issues that are very germane to this particular group. And I think it's just incredible. However, I think that not every place has the resources and bandwidth to be able to implement things as carefully as they might need to be, or as much as they may want to even. And so I think that that's another critical piece, that when we look at meta-analyses, for example, which show short-term changes in attitudes and behaviors, and occasionally, in the willingness to intervene and that kind of thing, we're not necessarily seeing that bystander intervention prevents perpetration of sexual violence. And so I think that thinking about it as a primary prevention tool alone, and that is something that will prevent people from assaulting other people, is maybe, I think it's wishful thinking, and that there needs to be, as Shamus was pointing out, something augmented to that. So I don't think we need to necessarily change it. I think if you're doing it in a really thoughtful way and you're thinking about the community in which you're providing bystander interventions, that's fantastic. But I think that, there may be instances where we need to augment it with something else to really prevent perpetration from happening in the first place. So. I think we got a lot of really great questions here. I don't think I'm seeing too many other questions, so I don't know if there are other questions we should be responding to.
I also think we're out of time for people, so I know some people may have other commitments.
Okay.
I didn't know if Peter or Angie or there, Megan, yes. You're still muted, Megan.
Sorry, I hid my self view before, so I didn't realize that I popped back up when I turned my camera back on. Yeah, I'm not seeing any more questions coming in the chat. So unless we have any final questions, we probably can go ahead and wrap up. Angie, do you want to pull up that slide that has the future sessions on there? Okay, there, my self view is back, so I'm normal again. It's very weird to talk on Zoom and know people can see you and not be able to see yourself.
Are you seeing it?
We are seeing your notes page, but I think that's okay because it still has the same information on it. I think that's fine. But yeah, so the next session that we have coming up, we're going to have Groundwork, which is an organization based out of Madison that does anti-racism training for white folks. So we're going to have a session on anti-racism for white people. And then after that, we're going to have partners from Partners for Youth Empowerment, talk about online facilitation. Tanji Reese is going to talk about youth engagement, and Nubia Pena are going to talk about social justice as prevention later on in the series. If anyone has any questions about any of these, please feel free to reach out to us. The registrations for the Groundwork webinar and the Partners for Youth Empowerment webinar are both open already. So if you didn't get an email about that, please feel free to email myself or Angie or Sarah or Peter. And thank you so much to Jennifer and Shamus and Kate for presenting today. That was so fantastic. I'm a giant nerd, so I really loved that you shared like open access articles in the chat. I'm just saving them for later. I'm gonna have a bunch of fun. It's my birthday weekend. I'm gonna read a bunch of sexual violence research. It's gonna be awesome. And also, Kate, I would really love to connect with you at some point. But yeah, again, thank you so much to our presenters, and thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. And the recording should be up within a couple days. Anything else we need to share, Peter?
No, I think you said it all, Megan.
All right, awesome. Then we'll see y'all soon. Bye, have a good one.
Thanks, everyone.